David, this entire story of sadistic homosexual slayings would almost appear to be fiction, scripted with the full intention of shocking readers over and over again. It's that hard to believe. So many lives involved, so many killed over such a long period of time, and all of it going undetected. But it's not fiction. It's very real. A deadly conspiracy now listed as one of the most horrifying crimes in this century.
In Houston, Texas in the early 1970s, a man named Dean Corll tortured, raped, and murdered at least 28 boys and young men. He was assisted by two teenagers named David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. The teens were paid to lure boys to one of Corll's addresses, where they were restrained and eventually killed by either strangulation or a .22 caliber pistol. The bodies were buried in a number of different locations around the area. Teenage assistant Henley ended up shooting and killing Corll, which finally exposed the case to the public's attention. The killings would be known as the Houston mass murders. Corll is also known as the Candyman and the Pied Piper, because he and his family had owned and operated a candy store in Houston Heights, across from an elementary school, and he had been known to give free candy to local children. Around the same time, about 4 hours away in Dallas, Texas, John D. Norman was creating a massive network of child sex trafficking rings around the country, which Dallas police suspected may have actually funneled children to Corll. In Dallas, Norman had the Odyssey Foundation. In San Diego, there was the Conquest Agency, and in Chicago, there was the Norman Foundation and Epic International. It also appears Norman was connected to the Guyane Society, a pedophile organization founded in Europe whose members believed in establishing regular sexual contact with children prior to 8 years of age, which is reflected in the NAMBLA slogan, "Sex before 8 or it's too late." When Norman was first arrested in Texas, police seized a card file index of 30,000 contacts, including victims and clients of the sex ring, which used catalogs sent through the mail. It was implied that many of the contacts were politicians, clergy, and millionaires. Dallas PD sent the card index to the State Department for investigation, but the State Department rejected the evidence, claiming the cards were not relevant to any fraud case concerning a passport. The State Department destroyed everything. The State Department's lawyer Matthew Nimitz could not explain why the cards were only looked at as a passport issue, nor why they were not forwarded to the FBI or postal inspectors. All the time, the New York Times only referred to Norman's operation as a homosexual ring, and they featured a response from Ronald Gold, an official of the Gay Activist Alliance in New York, who commented on the police report and defended homosexual pederasty.
"I haven't the faintest idea of whether the police's outlines are true or not. I never heard of the group. The whole idea that because one person is older than another, he is automatically an exploiter is ludicrous."
After charges were levied against Norman in Texas, he fled to Chicago, where he formed the Delta Project. He wanted to expand his network of child sex slaves across the U.S. so they could be called to service men whenever and wherever needed. His plan involved establishing dormitories designed to house 3 to 4 children and monitored by 1 or more adults, who were known as Dons. In a presentation titled "Protection of Children Against Sexual Exploitation," Iowa Senator John C. Culver described Norman's program.
He sends out material and receives material from other agencies similar to his, which invites men to, well, one program is called the Dawn Program. In this program, he invites anyone who is willing to have a cadet, which is a young boy between the age of 13 and 19, right in there, to have him live in his house. A Dawn should take 1 to 3 cadets to live with him in his house. He would pay a fee of $50 a month for having these cadets live in his house. But at the same time, these cadets would not only serve him sexually, but would also any other members of the Delta Project, which is quite vast, would contact these Dons, and he can invite them for a weekend, and these people would in turn pay him for letting them use his facilities, his house and the youth, and John Norman would get a percentage of this back.
While it is not clear how extensive this operation became, when Chicago police arrested Norman in 1973, they said Norman's ring was active in Chicago, Dallas, and Los Angeles. They discovered a new list of 5,000 clients, contacts, and subscribers to Norman's self-published pedophile magazine entitled Hermes, but those names were never released and were eventually lost by the police. Hermes was one of 3 boy love newsletters published in the U.S. at the time. The other 2 were Better Life Monthly in California and Broad Street Journal out of Colorado. Norman somehow continued to publish Hermes while in jail, and he also enlisted the help of Philip Paskey, an inmate he met while in prison. Paskey was released prior to Norman, and Paskey took up publication of Hermes. The Chicago Tribune eventually discovered that Paskey was employed by the city of Chicago as a local swimming pool attendant. In 1977, 3 teenage boys inexplicably had their throats slit in Chicago. One of them had accused Norman of child molestation in 1973, so perhaps this was payback and a message to others to keep their mouths shut. As for Norman, he would eventually be released and was reconvicted of molestation in 1988, of child porn distribution in 1995 and 1998, and was released briefly from prison in San Diego in 2008 before dying the following year in Coalinga State Hospital. While Norman's crimes were being uncovered in Chicago, the Windy City was also being terrorized by a mass murderer named John Wayne Gacy, who explicitly took inspiration from Dean Corll. At the time, there was no connection made between Norman and Gacy, but we now know that Norman's underling, Philip Paskey, was being paid by Gacy's construction company for unknown services in the form of 3 cashed checks. It appears that the Delta Project had been trafficking children to the infamous killer clown, though no connection was ever drawn at the time and not much has been made of this fact since. Gacy also does not appear to have acted alone in the murders. Considering Gacy's connections, it appears he could have been a fall guy for a well-connected network of predators. Gacy was a staunch supporter of the Democratic Party. His construction company would provide work for the DNC, and he eventually became a Democrat precinct captain. In this capacity, he met and was photographed with Rosalind Carter, wife of Democrat President Jimmy Carter. Carter posed for pictures with Gacy, who had been approved by the Secret Service, as evidenced by the pin on his jacket, and the First Lady autographed the photo, "To John Gacy, best wishes, Rosalind Carter." Gacy was also part of the Fraternal Order River Grove Moose Lodge, located near an elementary school, and perhaps more significantly, he was a member of the influential Waterloo JCs, otherwise known as the United States Junior Chamber. He would become JC Vice President, serve on the board of directors, and be elected Man of the Year twice. The second time he became Man of the Year was when he was in prison, where he set up a chapter of the JCs. Gacy was then serving time for the abuse of Donald Voorhees, the son of a fellow JC's member who he employed. Gacy got Voorhees alone, got the boy drunk, explained to him how the Kinsey Report on human sexuality showed that the first sexual experience of most young boys was performing oral sex on an older man, and showed Voorhees pornographic films before sexually assaulting him. Gacy told Voorhees that he is connected to the mob, so Voorhees better not say anything, and then he paid the boy $50. On another occasion, Gacy would anally violate Voorhees, who was a wreck afterward, and eventually told the police what Gacy did to him. It was through the investigation into the Voorhees' case that Gacy was also found to have engaged in sexual acts with other teenage boys, including a fry cook he employed named Edward Lynch. Gacy not only raped the young man, but when Lynch refused Gacy's advances, he shackled him to a bed, threatened him with a knife, then choked him to the point of urinating on the bed and losing consciousness. The other boys had been handcuffed and raped. Gacy would only admit to having sex with Voorhees, but claimed it was consensual and that he only partook out of curiosity. The judge didn't buy it, and on December 3rd, 1968, Gacy was found guilty of sodomy and sentenced to serve 10 years at the Iowa State Reformatory for Men. Gacy ended up only serving 18 months and then was welcomed right back into the community, seemingly as if nothing had happened. Allowed back on the streets, John Wayne Gacy would end up being accused of raping other boys, once while dressed as a police officer. Although the charges were dropped, he would then turn to killing many boys and young men, some of whom worked for Gacy's PDM Construction, and sometimes Gacy murdered while dressed as Pogo the Clown, which was a character he played for children's birthday parties. He would often handcuff and strangle his victims, just like his inspiration Dean Corll, then bury the bodies under his Chicago ranch, and once that became full, they would be brought to Des Plaines River. The parents of one of the early victims, John Butkovich, were convinced that Gacy was involved in the boys' disappearance and called the police at least once a week for nearly 2 years, urging them to investigate Gacy. Had the police followed the Butkovich's instructions, the lives of at least 30 other young men and teenage boys could have been spared. Police eventually did catch on to all the evidence that connected Gacy to the disappearance of a number of young men, in particular a 15-year-old boy who had worked at a pharmacy. Gacy was questioned but denied any involvement. Police checked Gacy's criminal history and discovered that he had served a prison sentence for sodomy involving 2 teenagers and had been charged with a sex-related aggravated assault involving 2 teenagers. Armed with a search warrant on December 13, 1978, investigators found several suspicious items: a 1975 high school class ring, other people's driver's licenses, handcuffs, a syringe, clothing too small for Gacy, and a photo receipt from the pharmacy where the teenager had worked. Law enforcement assigned 2 surveillance teams to follow Gacy while they continued their investigation. Gacy would invite the detectives out for drinks and meals, and even once told them,
"You know, clowns get away with murder."
Further investigation into Gacy's background linked him to the disappearance of 3 additional young people. One of Gacy's employees also revealed that Gacy had paid him to dig trenches in the crawl space of Gacy's home. On December 20th, 1978, Gacy invited 2 of the surveillance team members to come inside his residence. The police officers noticed an odd smell emanating from a heating duct. During the previous search, the heating furnace had not been turned on. On December 21st, detectives obtained a second search warrant. While the search commenced, officers arrested Gacy and took him to jail. Upon digging in the crawl space of Gacy's home, crime scene investigators soon found human remains. At the jail, after being told that investigators had found human skeletal remains in the crawl space at his home, Gacy told the detectives that he wanted to clear the air. In the early hours of December 22nd, Gacy admitted to detectives that he had committed approximately 30 murders, all of them teenage males. Once back at Gacy's residence, the young men would be handcuffed and choked as they were sexually assaulted. Some of the teenagers had been strangled with a tourniquet, which Gacy referred to as his rope trick. Most of the victims, Gacy said, were buried in the crawl space of his home, where periodically he would pour lime to hasten the decomposition of the corpses. Testimony would reveal that Gacy did not act alone, but all of the murders were conveniently pinned solely on him anyway, with no one else being charged. During questioning, 2 young men who had worked for Gacy were telling the police what they knew about bringing young men to Gacy's house for parties and about digging holes under his house. But then the mother of one of them went to the Des Plaines police station and demanded an end to the questioning. The mother identified herself as daughter of Vito Marzullo, a powerful Chicago alderman. The attorney she brought with her was Ed Hanrahan, former state's attorney to Cook County. The 2 boys went home and were never charged. Gacy himself said that some of the victims found in his home were not killed by him, but were instead murdered by others who used his home while he was out of town. He says that the bodies who were shown to have died from suffocation were not killed by him, as he preferred strangulation. Witness testimony also revealed that there were other people present in Gacy's house when Gacy murdered his victims. Adding to the confusion of the case, one of Gacy's supposed victims later showed up alive and well after having left his parents and moved to Florida. Another was also found alive after having been falsely identified as a corpse. It also turns out that one of the bodies had been misidentified, leaving one mother to question what actually happened to her missing son. Gacy was charged with 33 counts of murder, the most ever attributed to one person within the county at that time. Gacy tried pleading not guilty by reason of insanity, but was found guilty on all 33 counts of murder and ordered to serve 12 death sentences, in addition to 21 consecutive life sentences. On May 9, 1994, with all appeals and judicial review exhausted, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection. Back in 1978, the year Gacy was arrested, the very first federal statute on child pornography was passed into law. While forbidding production and sale, the statute placed no restrictions at all on the possession or trade of such materials. In 1980, the Evening Independent out of St. Petersburg, Florida, carried a story about a child pornography ring that reached from Florida to California, which was broken up after one of the criminals involved accidentally dropped off a roll of film to be developed that contained explicit images of child rape. Young boys would be flown into Mississippi and chauffeured via limo to a farm where they would be photographed naked and raped. The boys would be given expensive toys and rewarded with trips to places like Disneyland and Disney World. It was pictures from these trips that were supposed to be developed. The parents of the children all had given permission for their children to go to the farm, thinking it was for hunting and fishing expeditions. Back in Texas, a brave researcher was already beginning to put the pieces together and see some of the bigger picture. Dr. Tom Philpott was a professor who taught history at the University of Texas in Austin for over 20 years and was known for creating controversy with his activism. In 1981, he would be interviewed for a documentary film titled Boys for Sale. The film discusses the existence of an interstate child trafficking ring in the United States perpetrated by the political elite. Philpott tells the story of child victims throughout the United States. He describes Houston, Texas as possibly the worst city in the United States for homeless boys, and that around 350 are deliberately killed each year. 31 boys alone died suspiciously in 1981 and were not deemed homicide cases. Claims of atrocities in Houston are corroborated by other experts, such as Judy-Ann Denson Gerber of the Odyssey Institute, who adds that children are also brought in from Louisiana and other states. Dr. Philpott also describes common characteristics of these pederasts, saying that most men who victimize boys consider themselves heterosexual and live completely different lives when they are not committing abuses. Most often the perpetrators are wealthy individuals, which allows them the funds to purchase the boys. Dr. Philpott also states that these are not typical organized criminals, but rather the pillars of our society. As he said, it's serving the most respected people in our society. The biggest case for Philpott in the film is the story of a New Orleans Boy Scout troop, Troop 137, who were used as child prostitutes for major politicians in and around 1976. He said congressmen and top political leaders from Louisiana and a neighboring state were involved as customers. Dr. Philpott's reporting of this case was incredibly ahead of its time. Documents related to this case were only released in 2012, having been kept secret by the Boy Scouts of Texas. Also recounted was the story of House of Representatives member Robert E. Bowman, who in February 1980 had sex with a 16-year-old boy. All charges were dropped as long as Bowman agreed to drug and alcohol classes. Bowman was able to remain in office and ran unsuccessfully for re-election. There's also the story of House of Representatives member Joseph P. Wyatt Jr. A young boy filed a formal complaint against Wyatt with charges of soliciting him for sex. There was no trial and no charges were ever brought against Wyatt, but he did enter himself into drug and alcohol rehabilitation. To this day, stories about this event are almost non-existent and are saved only by Dr. Philpott's research. The list of accounts and stories go on. Philpott also mentions that it is young blonde-haired boys who bring in the highest price for child sex slavery rings. In 1982, Philpott was shot with his own .38 caliber pistol in a home invasion. The shooting and constant death threats did little to shake the resolve of Dr. Philpott. According to a 1982 article from Texas Monthly, in fact, he had been expecting something of the sort for a long time. He said he had made mortal enemies by investigating pederasty and organized child prostitution. He interpreted the attack as an attempt to discredit his work by creating the impression that he had committed suicide. Dr. Philpott would die of alleged suicide on October 9, 1991. Almost no information exists as to the exact cause and circumstances of his death, but in Dr. Philpott's University of Texas obituary, it is alluded that he was suffering depression due to growing issues about the Gulf War. The police did no autopsy as the cause of death was ruled a suicide. Shortly after Philpott's Boys for Sale was completed, in 1983, the McMartin Preschool in Manhattan Beach, California, was the first of what had since been described as a national epidemic of multi-victim, multi-perpetrator accusations of sexual and sadistic abuse, which erupted in the mid-1980s.